Day 50 and the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. 50 days without an arrest. 50 days without a named suspect. 50 days without any confirmed breakthrough made public. But this week, two specific developments landed that are changing the shape and direction of this investigation in ways that matter, in ways the public needs to understand fully. First, the Guthrie family broke weeks of silence with a new written statement. And for the very first time in 50 days, they pointed directly and specifically at the Tucson community. Their words were deliberate. Their words were chosen carefully. Someone local holds the key to finding resolution in this case. That is not a general appeal for tips. That is a targeted message aimed at a specific audience. And it was approved by the FBI before a single word was released publicly. Second, a former detective and state trooper with decades of behavioral analysis experience sat down with one of the most credible investigative reporters covering this case and publicly named a likely direction the abductor fled after taking Nancy. He identified where their base of operations probably is located: South Tucson, a specific area, a specific direction named publicly for the first time by someone with the professional credentials to make that assessment credibly. At the same time, the FBI is actively investigating a vacant house that sits adjacent to Nancy's property as a possible staging location used in the weeks and months before the abduction. A neighbor who moved out of that street before Nancy disappeared has reportedly been seen returning to the neighborhood after her disappearance. And every single date that investigators have flagged as significant in this entire investigation, January 11th, January 24th, and February 1st, every single one of those dates falls on a weekend. Not a Tuesday, not a Thursday morning. Weekends, every time. The question that investigators are now asking more directly than at any previous point is whether the person who took Nancy Guthrie is someone who works a regular structured job in Tucson during the week and has been using their weekends to conduct surveillance, case the neighborhood, plan the operation, and eventually execute a plan that was months in the making. Because the accumulating evidence is pointing in that direction more clearly with each passing week. And if that is what the evidence is saying, then the person who took her may have driven past the memorial that has grown outside her home, may have watched the news coverage from a television in a house a few miles away, may be going to work on Monday morning in this city and coming home on Friday evening to a life that looks completely ordinary to everyone around them. Before we go through every piece of this carefully, because each thread connects to the others in ways that fragmented coverage of this case has not fully laid out, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Vault and have notifications turned on. We bring you investigative analysis that connects evidence patterns, mainstream media reports, and fragments without showing you the full picture. Hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button to support coverage that examines what investigators are actually focusing on versus what generates headlines. Drop a comment telling us whether you think the person who took Nancy is someone local to Tucson who works a regular job during the week. Your engagement helps this reach people in the Tucson community who might recognize these patterns and have information. And if you know anything, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number is 1-800-225-5324. Over $1 million in reward money is waiting. Now let's examine why investigators believe someone local is responsible and what the evidence pattern reveals about who took Nancy Guthrie. Day 50 and the Guthrie family finally broke their silence. Not through an emotional Instagram video, not through a press conference, through a carefully constructed written statement that was released to Tucson's local NBC affiliate KVOA. And in an active federal kidnapping investigation at this stage of the case, statements like this one do not simply express grief. They carry messages. Every single word in a statement like this is deliberate. Every phrase has been reviewed. Nothing gets through without federal sign-off. When the Guthrie family puts words on paper at day 50 of an active FBI investigation, those words are operational. They mean something specific to a specific audience. Brian Enton is NewsNation's senior investigative reporter, and he has been on the ground in Tucson since nearly the first days of this investigation. He analyzed every word of that statement publicly and was direct about what it means and how it was constructed. This statement, he said, nothing in it is accidental. And the words that stopped every investigative reporter and every law enforcement analyst covering this case were these: "We continue to believe it is Tucsonans, Tucson, and the greater southern Arizona community. that hold the key to finding resolution, in this case, Tucsonans. That is a specific word, not a stranger passing through on an interstate. Not someone from another state who targeted this neighborhood from a distance. Tucsonans, people who live in that city, people who know those streets from regular daily experience, people who could have driven past Nancy Guthrie's house on a routine basis without anyone questioning their presence because they belong in that geography. They are part of the visual landscape of that neighborhood. They are not anomalies. They are regulars. Enton said he has been hearing this from law enforcement sources repeatedly since the early days of this investigation. The belief that exists inside the Joint Task Force is that whoever did this is local, is from the Tucson-area, and could potentially be from that specific neighborhood or the immediately surrounding streets. This belief has been a quiet but persistent current running through the investigative thinking from the beginning. For the first time at day 50, the family is now saying it publicly in a statement that has the FBI's fingerprints all over its language and construction. That is not a routine update. That is a deliberate public signal sent to a deliberate audience. The statement also named something that had never been mentioned publicly by the family before: the late evening of January 11th. Not just the date January 11th, which has come up in investigative discussions before. The late evening of January 11th specifically, a time of day. Enton's sources are telling him that the doorbell camera photographs showing the suspect without a backpack, which are visually distinct from the February 1st images where he arrives fully equipped and mission-ready, may be from January 11th. This matters because it places the first confirmed visit to that property on a specific evening 3 weeks before the abduction, and begins to build a documented timeline of surveillance that stretches back further than most public coverage has acknowledged. 4 independent networks have reported this. ABC, NBC, Fox, and NewsNation all reported based on 4 separate independent law enforcement sources that the surveillance photographs captured on the doorbell camera come from different dates and represent different visits. The sheriff has pushed back on that interpretation publicly and repeatedly, but Enton's sources inside the investigation are holding firm on that reporting. Now look at the dates that investigators have flagged and look at them with the specific attention they deserve, because this pattern has been sitting in plain sight throughout this investigation and has not received the analytical attention it warrants. January 11th falls on a Sunday. January 24th falls on a Saturday. February 1st, the night Nancy was taken, begins in the early morning hours of a Sunday. Every single date the FBI has identified as significant in this case, every confirmed or probable visit to that property, every flagged date on the investigative timeline falls on a weekend. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern, and patterns in criminal behavior are not random. They reflect the constraints and the structure of the person's regular life. This pattern points unmistakably to someone with a structured weekday life, someone who works or attends school or has some form of regular obligation that runs Monday through Friday and gives them Saturdays and Sundays to operate. Someone local enough to this neighborhood that a weekend trip there does not require hours of travel or overnight logistics. Someone who can drive to the Catalina Foothills on a Saturday evening, walk past a house, assess the conditions, decide the timing is not right yet, and drive back home without it costing them anything significant. Someone who can come back the following weekend and the weekend after that until the conditions are exactly what they need them to be. That behavioral profile is not a drifter. It is not a transient. It is not someone who traveled from another state to commit this crime. It is a person embedded in the daily rhythm of Tucson, someone with roots in this city, someone for whom that neighborhood is familiar geography, part of their regular world. Think about what this weekend pattern reveals about the operational constraints this person was working under. They could not conduct surveillance on a Wednesday afternoon because they had obligations elsewhere. They could not execute the abduction on a Thursday night because they needed to be somewhere Friday morning. But weekends provided freedom. Weekends provided time. Weekends provided the operational window necessary to drive to the Catalina Foothills, spend hours if necessary observing and planning, and return home without anyone in their regular life questioning where they were or what they were doing. This is someone whose calendar dictates their criminal activity. Someone whose job or school schedule or family obligations create a framework within which they have to operate. And that framework points to normalcy, points to structure. points to someone living what appears from the outside to be a completely ordinary Tucson life, while planning and executing a targeted abduction on the weekends when their time was their own. Now to the development that generated the most significant new analytical framework. This week, former detective and state trooper Morgan Wright sat down with Brian Enton and described Nancy Guthrie's abductor using a specific term that comes directly from criminal behavioral analysis: a marauder. This is not casual language. In behavioral profiling, a marauder is a defined category of offender with specific and documented characteristics. A marauder operates from a fixed home base. They range out from that base to commit the offense, and then they return to it. They are not traveling from another city. They are not strangers passing through a region they do not know. They live close enough to their target to come and go with relative ease. Close enough to abort a plan if something interrupts it and return the following weekend without significant cost or logistical difficulty. Close enough to observe from a distance over an extended period and develop the detailed operational knowledge of the target's routines and vulnerabilities that this crime clearly required. The term marauder has specific meaning in geographic profiling, a specialized discipline within criminal behavioral analysis that maps the spatial patterns of serial offenders to predict where they live based on where they strike. Geographic profilers study hundreds of solved cases and identify consistent patterns. Marauders commit crimes within their comfort zone. Within geography they know intimately from living or working there. They know the streets. They know the traffic patterns. They know which routes have cameras and which don't. They know where to park without attracting attention. They know how long it takes to get from point A to point B. All of that local knowledge creates operational advantages that someone from outside the area simply cannot replicate no matter how much research they do. And Wright did not stop at the behavioral category. He named a direction. Based on the way the suspect was dressed that night, his apparent need to move quickly after the abduction was completed, and the specific geography of the Catalina Foothills area, Wright assessed that the abductor's base of operations was likely toward South Tucson. The mountains to the north make that direction logistically impractical for someone trying to move fast and return to familiar ground quickly. The accessible routes, the geography that makes sense for someone trying to exit the area without using major surveillance-heavy corridors, point south. South Tucson is where Wright's decades of behavioral analysis experience is pointing. A former detective and state trooper with the professional credentials to make this assessment is giving this investigation a geographic target that is as specific as anything that has been said publicly about the location of this suspect. That deserves to be taken seriously. Wright's assessment is based on multiple factors that all point in the same direction. The suspect's clothing suggests someone comfortable in that environment, someone who knew the area well enough to dress appropriately for moving through it at night. The speed with which the abduction was executed, 16 minutes from motion detection inside Nancy's house to her pacemaker disconnecting as she was driven away, suggests someone who had an escape route planned and knew exactly how to navigate it efficiently. The lack of forced entry, the precise positioning of the vehicle on the driveway, the confidence with which the suspect approached and disabled the ring camera, all of it points to familiarity, to local knowledge, to someone who had been there before and knew the terrain. Now layer that geographic assessment on top of what the FBI has confirmed is actively being investigated in the immediate neighborhood around Nancy's property. A vacant house adjacent to her home is being actively examined as a potential staging location. Retired Pima County SWAT Commander Bob Cleary spoke to Parade magazine about this, and his assessment was specific and detailed. A vacant property in that location could have served as a home base or staging location for someone conducting extended pre-abduction surveillance. It provides a cover story for being in that neighborhood at varying hours across multiple weeks. It gives a physical location from which to observe Nancy's daily patterns, her comings and goings, her schedule, which nights her lights went out early, which nights her driveway was empty, which nights she was completely and verifiably alone inside that house. Cleary went further than that. A vacant property like that, he said, could also be used to set up concealed surveillance equipment inside the structure itself, positioned to monitor activity on the street or at adjacent properties without any visible footprint on the street that would attract attention. Think about what that means in practical terms. Someone with access to a vacant house next door to Nancy's property could have spent weeks or months building an extraordinarily detailed picture of her daily life from a position that was physically a few feet away, with zero visible presence on that street. No car idling at the curb, no figure standing in a yard. Just a dark house that nobody thought twice about because vacant houses in residential neighborhoods do not attract attention. The tactical advantages of using a vacant house as a surveillance post are enormous. You can observe at any hour of day or night without anyone questioning why you're there. You can come and go through the back or side of the property without being visible from the street. You can leave equipment in place between visits without having to transport it back and forth. You can take notes, photograph the target property, document patterns over time, all from a position of complete concealment. Law enforcement uses similar tactics when conducting surveillance on suspects. They rent apartments or houses near the target and set up observation posts. The suspect in Nancy's case may have done exactly the same thing by identifying and gaining access to that vacant property next door. And then there is the neighbor detail that Brian Enton confirmed this week. The FBI is asking specific questions about a neighbor who moved out of that street before Nancy disappeared and was subsequently seen returning to the neighborhood after her disappearance. Not moving away and establishing a new life elsewhere. Moving away and coming back. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed to Fox News Digital on March 20th that detectives are actively evaluating reports of suspicious activity connected to that recently vacant property. And Nancy's neighbor of 30 years, Aldine Meister, provided the most direct account of how this came to investigators' attention. She told them specifically and on record, "The neighbors on the other side of me moved out. I wanted them to check that house. The FBI heard her, and they went back to that property. Why would someone who moved away from that street return to the neighborhood after Nancy disappeared? Innocent explanations exist. Maybe they left items behind and needed to retrieve them. Maybe they were showing the property to potential buyers or renters. Maybe they had friends still living on that street and came back to visit. But investigators don't ignore patterns like this. Someone moving away from a street where a major crime occurred and then returning to that street after the crime draws investigative attention because it's anomalous behavior. Most people who move away don't come back unless they have specific business there. And if that specific business involves the vacant property that's being investigated as a potential surveillance post, that makes the pattern even more significant. The FBI would be conducting detailed background checks on anyone associated with that vacant property, former residents, property owners, real estate agents who showed it, maintenance workers who had access, neighbors who might have noticed unusual activity there. All of that investigation happens quietly behind the scenes while the public coverage focuses on other elements. But it's happening. And if someone associated with that vacant property has other connections to the case, connections to construction sites in the neighborhood, connections to service providers who worked on Nancy's property or neighboring properties, those connections create a web that investigators can follow toward identification. Now let's build the full picture of what the confirmed evidence tells us about the sequence of visits to Nancy's property before February 1st. Because this sequence is the operational backbone of the entire case. The doorbell camera photographs confirmed by 4 independent networks drawing on 4 separate law enforcement sources show the suspect on at least 2 distinct visits to the property on different dates. The first visit presents a very different profile from the second. No backpack. The suspect studying the camera position, assessing the entrance, and apparently deciding conditions are not right before leaving. No confrontation, no entry, just observation and withdrawal. This is reconnaissance. This is a dry run. This is someone testing the approach, evaluating security measures, determining what equipment and tactics will be needed for the actual operation. The second visit is a completely transformed operational picture. Mask properly fitted, firearm holstered, backpack fully loaded with whatever equipment he brought that required the time to use inside that house. A plan that had been thought through, rehearsed mentally, and was now being executed. 2 visits. 2 completely different profiles. The gap between the first visit and the second visit is the time this person spent going home, sitting with what they observed, acquiring or organizing what they needed, and deciding when to come back. That gap is where the planning happened, where the suspect obtained the Ozark Trail backpack sold exclusively at Walmart, where they acquired or confirmed they had access to the firearm, where they obtained the ski mask and gloves and dark clothing, where they mentally rehearsed the sequence of actions they would take once they committed to entering Nancy's home. Someone who can abort on the first attempt and return on a later date is someone who does not have far to travel. Someone for whom that neighborhood is not a destination that required planning and logistics to reach. It is part of their accessible geography. It is a place they can reach on a weekend evening and return from without it being a significant undertaking. That is local. That is someone for whom the Catalina Foothills area is familiar ground. The ability to make multiple visits over multiple weekends without the trips themselves becoming logistically burdensome or noticeable to others in the suspect's life points to proximity. Points to someone who can tell family or roommates they're going out for a few hours and have that accepted as normal without detailed questions about where specifically they're going or when they'll be back. Now to the construction angle, because this is a thread the FBI is currently pulling with a level of specificity that tells you exactly how seriously they are taking it. The FBI is requesting the name of every single contractor and every single worker on multiple construction sites in the neighborhood surrounding Nancy's property. Not general inquiries about companies. Not broad requests for project records. Specific names. Every individual person who had a presence on those sites during the relevant window. Former FBI agent Steve Moore addressed this directly, and his reasoning is worth understanding in full. The theory that has driven significant investigative thinking from the beginning is that this crime was targeted, and that someone with daily legal unremarkable access to that specific street during January had something that is almost impossible to create from a distance or manufacture quickly. Think carefully about what daily construction access to a residential neighborhood actually provides to someone with a surveillance objective. You arrive every morning in a work truck with tools. You are expected to be there. Neighbors see you regularly enough that you become part of the visual background of the street. Nobody calls law enforcement about a work crew. Nobody approaches a person in work clothes and a hard hat and demands to know what they are doing there. You can stand on that block and observe which car is in which driveway. You can time how long it takes a specific resident to walk from their garage to their front door. You can identify where the security cameras are mounted, whether they appear to be actively recording or are simply installed without monitoring. You can note over days and weeks of daily presence which houses have dogs, which houses have visitors on certain evenings, which houses go dark early on weeknights, and which houses show activity late into the evening. You can observe Nancy Guthrie specifically. You can watch her come and go. You can see that she doesn't drive herself, that she's dependent on family or Uber for transportation. You can note that she's elderly with limited mobility. You can observe that she lives alone. You can identify her routine, when she's home and when she's away. All of that intelligence gathering happens under the cover of legitimate work. You're just a construction worker doing your job. Nobody questions your presence. Nobody wonders why you're standing on that street hour after hour, day after day. You blend into the background completely. Over weeks of daily legal presence on that street, someone with a surveillance objective could accumulate the kind of detailed operational knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's life and routines that this crime clearly required. What time does she wake up based on when lights come on in the morning? What time does she go to bed based on when the house goes dark at night? Does she have regular visitors who would notice quickly if something was wrong? Does she have medical alert systems or other monitoring that would trigger immediate response if she didn't check in? How long does it typically take from when she arrives home until all activity in the house ceases for the night? All of these details inform operational planning, and all of them are observable from a construction site on that street. And that person does not even need to be the individual who put on the mask on the night of February 1st. They simply need to have been in a position to observe and then to pass what they observed to someone who used it. This is why the FBI wants every name from those construction sites. Because if two people are involved, as former Detective Morgan Wright believes based on the reward not generating tips, one of those people might have been the observer who gathered intelligence while working legitimately in the neighborhood, and the other might have been the person who executed the abduction using that intelligence. That division of labor would explain how the operation could be so well informed about Nancy's routines, while the actual execution on February 1st showed some tactical amateurishness, like the gun holster positioning that former FBI agent Johnny Grusing noted was not professionally sound. The FBI is systematically working through every construction worker's background. They're looking at criminal history. They're looking at family connections to the Tucson area. They're looking at where these workers live, whether any of them live in or near South Tucson, as Morgan Wright's geographic analysis suggests the abductor's home base is located. They're looking at work schedules to see who is working Monday through Friday with weekends off, which would align with the pattern of all significant dates falling on weekends. They're looking at who had access to work vehicles that might match descriptions of vehicles seen in the neighborhood on the surveillance dates. They're building comprehensive profiles of every single person who had legitimate daytime access to that street during the window when surveillance of Nancy's property was occurring. Subscribe to True Crime Vault and turn on all notifications for updates as this investigation develops. Like this video to support coverage that connects evidence patterns instead of just reporting isolated developments. Share this video with people in the Tucson community because someone local might recognize these behavioral patterns. Someone might remember seeing a work crew in the Catalina Foothills during January. Someone might know a person whose weekend schedule changed around these dates. Comment with your thoughts on whether the person who took Nancy works a regular job during the week and used weekends for surveillance. Visit our channel for comprehensive coverage of every angle of Nancy's case. And if you have any information about construction workers in that neighborhood, about the vacant house next door, about anyone whose behavior changed around February 1st, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or Pima County Sheriff at 520-351-4900. Over $1 million in reward money is waiting. Now to one more element that was raised this week by a forensic behavioral expert, Brant Smith, and that deserves serious attention in the context of everything else we know about this case. In cases of this type, Smith told Fox News Digital, suspects frequently return to the crime scene after the fact, and she was specific about what that behavior actually looks like in documented cases. This is the type of person, she said, who could come back to the memorial that has grown outside Nancy's home, who could stand among the people leaving flowers and candles, who could take photographs of the tribute, who could watch the vigils from within the crowd of mourners, and who could observe the news coverage and the public response from a position of apparent normalcy among the people who were grieving. This is not speculation. This is documented behavior in other high-profile abduction and murder cases. Suspects return to crime scenes for multiple psychological reasons. Some return to relive the crime, to experience again the power and control they felt during the act. Some return to monitor the investigation, to see what evidence might have been found, to assess whether they left anything behind that could identify them. Some return because they're inserted into the community response. They want to be part of the public grieving to maintain the appearance of normalcy. And some return because they genuinely didn't anticipate the scale of community response, and they're drawn to see how their actions affected people. Brian Enton stated this directly and on the record on his broadcast. It is possible, he said, that the suspect has already been seen in footage filmed outside Nancy's house during public events. The memorial outside Nancy's home has attracted hundreds of people over the 50 days since she disappeared. Neighbors bringing flowers, community members lighting candles, news crews filming the growing tribute. All of those public gatherings have been photographed and recorded, and investigators have been watching every person who appeared at that memorial, every single person. They're reviewing footage looking for anyone who appears multiple times, anyone who lingers longer than expected. Anyone whose body language or behavior seems inconsistent with genuine grief. Anyone who appears to be observing the scene rather than participating in the mourning. Facial recognition technology allows investigators to compare faces captured at the memorial against faces captured in other contexts, against employee photos from construction companies, against driver's license photos of former residents of that street, against surveillance footage from stores where the Ozark Trail backpack or other equipment might have been purchased. The technology exists to cross-reference faces across multiple databases and multiple sources of footage. And if someone who attended the memorial also appears in footage from a Walmart purchasing a backpack matching the one visible in Nancy's Ring camera footage, or appears in employee records from a construction site in the Catalina Foothills, or appears in any other context that connects them to this investigation, that's a lead worth pursuing. The suspect may believe that blending into a crowd of mourners provides cover, that being one person among hundreds makes them invisible. But investigators are not looking at the crowd as a whole. They're looking at each individual person within that crowd. They're documenting faces, They're noting vehicles parked nearby. They're tracking who attended on which dates. All of that documentation creates a database that can be searched and analyzed. And if a pattern emerges, if someone appears at the memorial multiple times, if someone was also seen in the neighborhood on one of the surveillance dates, if someone has any connection, however tangential, to Nancy or her property, that person becomes a person of interest. Now to the DNA, because this is where the case ultimately resolves, and the local angle adds critical dimensions to the DNA picture that have not been fully explained in the public coverage of this investigation. Foreign DNA was recovered from inside Nancy's home. Genetic material not connected to her and not connected to anyone with regular authorized access to that property. A complex mixed profile with more than one contributor that is currently being processed at a private laboratory in Florida. The fact that the profile is described as mixed and complex with more than one contributor suggests that multiple people's genetic material is present in the sample. This could mean 2 people were inside Nancy's home during the abduction. Or it could mean the sample contains DNA from the perpetrator mixed with DNA from someone else who had legitimate access to the property at an earlier time. Forensic genetic genealogy has been formally initiated on that sample. This is the same methodology that identified Brian Kohberger in the University of Idaho murders. It is the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, after more than 4 decades of investigation. The methodology works by taking an unknown DNA profile and building a family tree outward from partial matches with relatives who have voluntarily submitted their genetic material to consumer platforms like GED Match or 23andMe or Ancestry. It does not require the suspect's DNA to already exist in any law enforcement database. It requires one connection, one distant cousin, one family member anywhere in the country who shared their genetics with a genealogy service. And from that single connection, the tree builds outward and inward simultaneously until it narrows to a name. The process is methodical and time-consuming, but extraordinarily effective when properly executed. Forensic genealogists upload the unknown DNA profile to genealogy databases and look for matches. Even distant matches, 4th or 5th cousins, provide starting points. From those matches, genealogists build family trees backward through generations to find common ancestors. Then they build the trees forward again through all the descendants of those common ancestors. Eventually, those trees narrow to a specific geographic area and a specific set of family surnames. Investigators then identify all living males within the right age range from those family lines who live in or have connections to the relevant geographic area. In Nancy's case, that relevant geographic area is Tucson, and specifically South Tucson, based on the behavioral analysis. Brian Enton has said directly and with conviction that he believes DNA is what ultimately cracks this case open. Forensics expert April Stonehouse confirmed that the processing of the available samples has been moving rapidly. Retired FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer told Newsweek that the case is red hot behind the scenes, with more active investigative leads than most comparable cases ever generate at this stage. The DNA processing that started weeks ago is now in the phase where trees are being built and potential matches are being identified. That work happens away from public view, but it happens systematically, and it produces results. Now here is what the local angle specifically adds to the DNA picture and why it matters beyond what the general coverage has explained. If the abductor is from Tucson, if their base of operations is somewhere in or around South Tucson, as the behavioral analysis suggests, if they worked on a construction site in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood during January, or if they spent time inside that vacant house adjacent to Nancy's property during the surveillance period, then their DNA is not only potentially present inside her home. On the night of the abduction, their genetic material may be present on surfaces touched during the weeks of surveillance visits that preceded February 1st. A gate latch touched during reconnaissance on January 11th, when the suspect first visited without a backpack. A doorbell button pressed to test whether it would trigger the camera. A utility box that was vandalized near her property and that investigators have already flagged as part of the investigation. A railing touched for balance while climbing steps during surveillance. Any surface casually contacted during reconnaissance visits that happened weeks before anyone was looking for forensic evidence. All of those surfaces may contain DNA that's been sitting there unprotected, undisturbed, waiting to be collected once investigators identified them as relevant. Every name the FBI is collecting from those construction site rosters is a potential DNA comparison point. If forensic genetic genealogy narrows to a specific family tree, and that family tree includes someone who worked construction in the Catalina Foothills during January, investigators can request a DNA sample from that person. If the person refuses voluntarily, investigators can obtain samples from items that person discarded. A coffee cup thrown away at a work site. A cigarette butt discarded on a public sidewalk. Any item that person touched and abandoned becomes a source of comparison DNA that can be collected legally without a warrant. Every former resident of that street is a potential match candidate. If the neighbor who moved away before Nancy disappeared and was seen returning afterward has any connection to the family trees being built through genetic genealogy, that person becomes a priority for DNA comparison. Every worker who moved through that neighborhood during January and whose identity can be established as a person whose genetic profile can be compared against what is sitting in that Florida laboratory right now. The power of combining traditional investigation with genetic genealogy is that traditional investigation identifies suspects through behavior and connections, and genetic genealogy either confirms or eliminates those suspects through biology. The two methodologies working in parallel create a system where suspects have nowhere to hide. And genetic genealogy does not wait for the suspect to have a prior criminal record. It does not depend on them ever having been arrested or processed in any law enforcement system. It needs one relative, one distant family member who shared their DNA with a consumer service at any point. And in 2026, with the genealogy database populations that currently exist, the probability that any individual in the United States has 0 relatives who have ever submitted a sample to any consumer platform approaches 0. Everyone has cousins. Everyone has extended family. And someone in that extended family somewhere has submitted DNA to learn about their ancestry or find biological relatives. The tree will build. The question is only how long it takes. In the Golden State Killer case, it took genealogists several months to build the family trees and narrow to Joseph DeAngelo's name. In the University of Idaho case, it took weeks. The speed depends on how many genetic matches exist in the databases, how well documented the family trees are, how many living descendants there are to work with. But the methodology works. It has solved dozens of cold cases, and it is being applied right now to Nancy's case with the full resources of the FBI and private forensic laboratories behind it. This week, the sheriff said something in a local Tucson radio interview that was notably more candid and less guarded than anything he has said in any of his national media appearances. He said, and the phrasing is worth noting exactly, "Yes, I know a lot, but I am not going to share that with the public. It is about protecting the integrity of the investigation." He knows something. The FBI knows something. And what they know is significant enough that revealing it publicly would compromise their ability to build a prosecutable case. That statement from the sheriff is not vague bureaucratic deflection. It is confirmation that the investigation has developed specific intelligence that has not been made public. Intelligence that creates investigative advantage only as long as the suspect doesn't know investigators have it. What might that intelligence be? It could be DNA results that have narrowed to a specific family tree, but not yet to a specific name. It could be surveillance footage from cameras in the neighborhood that captured a vehicle or a person that investigators are working to identify. It could be cell phone data that places specific phones near Nancy's property on multiple surveillance dates. It could be witness statements from construction workers or neighbors that haven't been made public. It could be forensic analysis of the ring camera or other evidence recovered from Nancy's home that revealed details only the perpetrator would know. Whatever it is, it's significant. And the sheriff's willingness to acknowledge publicly that he knows more than he's sharing suggests confidence that the investigation is progressing toward resolution. The DNA processing that is running right now in that private laboratory in Florida may be the mechanism that finally converts what they know from investigative intelligence into courtroom-ready evidence that can support a prosecution. DNA evidence is powerful in court because it's objective and scientific. A jury can understand that DNA either matches or it doesn't. There's no ambiguity, no interpretation, just biological fact. If genetic genealogy identifies a suspect and direct DNA comparison confirms that person's genetic material was inside Nancy's home on the night of February 1st, that's evidence that can anchor an entire prosecution. Everything else, the behavioral analysis pointing to someone local, the construction worker theory, the weekend pattern, all of it becomes corroboration that explains why this particular person's DNA is where it shouldn't be. Now, there is one section of the Guthrie family statement released this week that did not make the headlines of most coverage, but that is arguably the most significant thing the family has said publicly in 50 days. And it needs to be heard in full and understood for what it is actually saying. The family wrote that they want to celebrate Nancy's beautiful and courageous life, but that they cannot do that until she is brought to a final place of rest. Read that phrase again carefully. A final place of rest. Not until she comes home. Not until she walks back through the door of the house she has lived in for years. A final place of rest. That is a family that has been living with the full weight of what the evidence and the passage of time are telling them. That is a family that loves their mother completely and is also beginning to prepare gently and with evident heartbreak for every possibility that 50 days without proof of life may represent. 50 days is a long time for an 84-year-old woman with medical needs to be missing without any confirmed contact. Nancy requires daily cardiac medication. She has a pacemaker that monitors her heart function and that went silent at 2:28 a.m. on February 1st when it lost connection to her phone. That silence has continued for 50 days. No reconnection, no signal, no indication the pacemaker is still functioning. Medical experts would tell you that an 84-year-old woman with cardiac issues who hasn't had access to her medications for 50 days faces serious health risks. The family knows this, the FBI knows this, and the careful phrasing of their statement reflects the painful reality they're facing. And then they wrote this: "We cannot grieve, we can only ache and wonder." Those words were approved by the FBI. Those words were chosen deliberately. And those words describe exactly what it looks like to be 50 days into the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman who requires daily cardiac medication, who has a pacemaker that went silent on the night of February 1st, and from whom no credible proof of life has emerged in nearly 2 months. We cannot grieve, because grief requires finality, requires knowing, requires the ability to say goodbye and begin the process of healing. But without Nancy's body recovered, without confirmation of what happened to her, without answers about where she is, the family cannot grieve. They exist in a state of suspended anguish where hope and heartbreak occupy the same space. We can only ache and wonder. Ache for Nancy wherever she is. Wonder what happened during those moments inside her home. Wonder whether she suffered. Wonder whether she's still alive somewhere despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. Wonder whether the person responsible is someone they know, someone who's been part of their community, someone who stood among the mourners at the memorial pretending to care. The uncertainty is its own form of torture, and the family's willingness to express that torture publicly in language this raw suggests they've reached a point where pretending everything will be fine is no longer sustainable. 50 days. A family that has done everything right throughout all of it. Savannah breaking down on Instagram in videos that were painful to watch, pleading directly to whoever took her mother to bring her home. Annie weeping audibly at the memorial outside her mother's home, holding flowers and candles with shaking hands. Cameron speaking directly on camera to whoever took their mother, offering understanding and compassion if they would just tell the family where Nancy is. A family that cooperated fully with every investigative request, submitted to interviews, provided access to Nancy's home and records, did everything investigators asked without hesitation. That offered $1 million reward from their own resources to incentivize tips. That stood in front of every camera available to them, national and local, to keep Nancy's face and story in the public consciousness. That held on publicly through everything, through the initial terror and the dawning realization and the crushing weight of time passing without answers. And now, in a carefully crafted statement approved by the FBI, they are beginning gently and with evident courage to hold open space for every possible truth about where their mother is. They're not giving up. They're not stopping their advocacy, but they're acknowledging reality. They're preparing themselves for the possibility that Nancy may never walk back through their door, that the resolution they're fighting for may be justice rather than reunion, that finding Nancy may mean laying her to rest rather than bringing her home alive. It's heartbreaking to witness a family reaching this point, but it's also a testament to their strength that they can face this possibility and continue fighting for answers. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in that community for decades, raised her family there, built a life there. She had dinner with her family on a Saturday evening, played card games, laughed, told stories, shared love, and trusted the world around her completely. She deserved to go home safely that night. She deserved to wake up Sunday morning in her own bed. She deserved to continue living the quiet, peaceful life she'd built. She deserved safety and dignity and the protection of the community she'd been part of for so long. She deserved all of that, and she didn't get it. And somebody in Tucson knows why. Somebody who works a regular job in this city during the week. Somebody who knows those streets from personal daily experience. Somebody whose presence in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood during January didn't raise any flags because they had legitimate reason to be there. Somebody who may have stood on that specific street and watched that specific house from the outside across multiple weekends leading up to February 1st. Somebody who made reconnaissance visits on January 11th and January 24th, observed Nancy's routines, planned the timing, acquired the equipment, and eventually executed the plan they'd been developing for weeks. Somebody who knows exactly where they went after they left that neighborhood in the early morning hours of February 1st and exactly what they did when they got there. Somebody who has been living with the full weight of what they did every single day since. The Guthrie family pointed directly at the Tucson community in a statement the FBI approved word by word. They didn't say someone somewhere might know something. They said Tucsonans hold the key. They said the greater southern Arizona community has the information needed to solve this case. That's specific. That's targeted. That's based on investigative intelligence suggesting the person responsible is local and embedded in that community. A former detective with decades of behavioral analysis experience named South Tucson as the likely base of operations for a marauder-type offender who ranges out from a fixed home base to commit crimes and returns to that base afterward. That's geographic profiling pointing to a specific area of the city where the person responsible likely lives or operates from. A vacant house immediately adjacent to Nancy's property is being investigated as a staging location for extended pre-abduction surveillance. A location from which someone could have watched Nancy's home for weeks or months, documenting her routines, identifying vulnerabilities, planning every detail of the eventual abduction. A neighbor who moved out of that street kept coming back after the disappearance. Behavior anomalous enough that other neighbors noticed and reported it to investigators. Every date investigators have flagged as significant falls on a weekend. January 11th, a Sunday. January 24th, a Saturday. February 1st, the early morning hours of a Sunday. That pattern points to someone with weekday obligations and weekend freedom. Someone whose calendar dictates when they can operate criminally. The FBI is requesting names of every construction worker who was on sites in that neighborhood during January. They're building comprehensive profiles of everyone who had daily legal access to that street. They're looking for connections between construction workers and the vacant house, between construction workers and the dates that fall on weekends, between construction workers and South Tucson. All of that systematic investigation is happening while DNA processing continues in a Florida laboratory. Forensic genetic genealogy building family trees from partial matches in consumer DNA databases. Trees that will eventually narrow to surnames and geographic areas and specific individuals who can then be investigated and eliminated or confirmed through direct DNA comparison. The DNA is in active processing. Forensic genetic genealogy has been initiated. Forensic experts say the case is red hot behind the scenes with more leads than most comparable cases generate. The sheriff said publicly this week that he knows things he cannot yet share because sharing them would compromise the investigation's integrity. All of that adds up to a case that is not cold, not stalled, not running out of investigative avenues. This is a case that is narrowing methodically and deliberately toward one geographic area, one neighborhood, one person who has been sustaining the ordinary appearance of a normal daily life in a city they call home while carrying the full weight of what they did on the night of February 1st. If you are in Tucson tonight and you know someone whose behavior changed in the days or weeks around February 1st, if you noticed a vehicle on your street on January 11th or January 24th that had no obvious reason to be there, if you worked construction in the Catalina Foothills area during January or early February and saw something during those weeks that did not sit right with you at the time, if you know someone who suddenly seemed different after the news of Nancy's disappearance broke, Someone who is quieter or more withdrawn or unusually interested in news coverage of the case. Make the call tonight. Contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number is 1-800-225-5324. You can submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov or contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department directly at 520-351-4900. Everything is completely anonymous. You don't have to give your name. You don't have to identify yourself. You don't have to meet anyone in person. The reward is over $1 million waiting for the information that leads to resolution. No ID required. Cash at a neutral location. The FBI handles this process thousands of times a year, and they protect the identity of tipsters absolutely. If you know something, if you suspect something, if you've noticed something that might be relevant, the only thing standing between Nancy's family and answers might be your willingness to make that call. Sometimes the right person sees the right story at exactly the right moment, and that one person could be the thing that brings Nancy home. 50 days. One family still waiting. One city that holds the answer. And an investigation that is closer tonight than it has ever been to the name at the end of that genealogy tree. To the person who drove to the Catalina Foothills on weekend evenings and watched Nancy's house from the shadows. To the construction worker who spent January gathering intelligence under the cover of legitimate work. To the neighbor who had access to that vacant house and used it as a surveillance post. To the person whose DNA is sitting in a Florida laboratory right now being compared against family trees being built by forensic genealogists. The circle is tightening. The investigation is narrowing. And someone in Tucson is running out of time to come forward before genetic science and systematic investigation converge on their name. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. Her family deserves answers. And the Tucson community that she was part of for so long deserves to know that justice will be served for what was taken from them on February 1st.